Thank you very much for waiting. We will start revision 2022, Accelerating Renewable Developments. Before we start the program, on behalf of the organizers, Chair of Executive Board, Renewable Energy Institute, Thomas Koeberger, will welcome all of you. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome to all of you in the audience to this Revision 2022. It is our annual big conference, for the third time organized via Zoom and other internet facilities. And it's also the slightly delayed 10-year anniversary of the existence of Renewable Energy Institute. The topic is the accelerating utilization of renewable energy in the world, and in particular, the development in Japan will be given attention. I would like to first welcome Alejandro Moreno, who is working with the US Department of Energy on renewable energy. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. And thank you to the Japan Renewable Energy Institute for the invitation to be here today at the Revision Conference. It is an honor. I will share my slides. There we go. I trust someone will tell me if it's not working. Thank you again. My name is Alejandro Moreno. I am the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Renewable Power at the US Department of Energy. What that means for those who are less familiar with the US Department of Energy, unlike many energy ministries around the world, we primarily focus on research and development, policy supports, analysis, but we are not a policy setting institution like many ministries are. And so that's the perspective I will bring here today. I will talk about a number of the challenges and opportunities for expanding renewable growth, but really the theme of this year's conference, accelerating renewable energy development in the US and across the world, is the critical step, or one of the critical steps to reaching our clean energy goals that are aligned not only with the US administration objectives, but equally so with the net zero energy goals that were put forth by the IEA last May, and that form the cornerstone of many countries and the international climate goals writ large. So much of what I say, even if it's focused on the US, is equally relevant in Japan and across the world. The organization I work for under the current administration, our mission is twofold. It's to help achieve a carbon-free electricity sector by 2035 and to equitably transition the country, the US, to a fully net zero emitting economy and energy system by no later than 2050. These are, of course, big, important goals. We in the Department of Energy come at it from a research and development perspective, but it will take the collaboration and the participation of all sectors of our society to be able to achieve these goals. Within DOE, as you can see on the right of the slide, we focus on 5 major priorities within the decarbonization of the energy system. The first, of course, is the decarbonization of the power sector itself by 2035. The second is decarbonizing energy-intensive industry. The third is decarbonizing transportation, both on road, but also in air and at sea and rail. The fourth is decarbonizing buildings, reducing and eliminating the carbon footprint of buildings. And the last is enabling a net zero agricultural sector. Equally important to achieving the decarbonization is achieving it in a way that benefits Americans and benefits people across the world. That means creating good jobs, creating an equitable and just energy system, and ensuring that the workforce and the university, what we call STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math fields in universities reflect America as a whole. If we don't achieve a transition that is just and equitable and benefits people, then we haven't achieved a transition at all. How do we get there, though? There are many ways. What you see here is one potential scenario that came out of a report from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that was conducted last year. That didn't get quite to 100%. It got to 95% decarbonized electricity by 2050. And what you see is simply a rate of acceleration of renewable energy and clean energy infrastructure that dwarfs what we have seen today, that is far greater than anything we have seen. We need to increase annual deployments of wind and solar power and other technologies by 4 or 5 times what we see today. And we need to continue that increase, not just through 2035, but all the way through 2050 to accommodate the increased demand from the electrification of industry and the electrification of transportation. This chart here is from the US, but it is very similar in most countries around the world. In addition to being my current role within the US government, I am also the chair of the IEA's Renewable Energy Working Party. I have seen graphs like this globally and in many countries, and for the most part, they look very similar. Of course, there are national differences, and the technologies that each country will use are different. One other element of increasing the amount of renewables on the power system and the electrification of the power system isn't just the aggregate amount of load that vehicles, electrified vehicles, for example, EVs, or higher industrial electrification will entail, but it also involves changes in the diurnal, the daily, and the seasonal load profiles that we haven't yet fully understood how to predict. One example here, which we think is likely, coming from that same study, is recognizing that as more and more heating switches from natural gas to electrification, the daily peaks in the electricity system may shift in the US. Right now, they are in summer afternoons, driven mostly by air conditioning. It's quite possible that in 5 or 10 years, those peaks may occur on winter mornings, driven by heat. What that means for the operation of the system, how we plan for capacity, is critical to get right in order to ensure resource adequacy and stable operation as we transition to an electrified economy and a more renewable driven power system. So how do we accomplish this in the US? These are some high-level principles that I will talk about first, and then I'll go into a couple example technologies of how they play out. These principles really are consistent across all of the technologies under our portfolio. The first is accelerating the deployment of the technologies that we have now and that are currently cost competitive. Right now, land-based wind and solar photovoltaics are competitive across large parts of the United States, large parts of the world. There are market barriers. There are regulatory and siting challenges. There is certainly a need to design projects and to site projects in a way that win the confidence and the trust of local communities and do so in a way that benefits those communities. All of those are critical to getting even technologies that work deployed at the rate that we need in order to see the goals that we have. The second is continuing to reduce the cost. Even though wind and solar are cost competitive in parts of the country, they're not always cost competitive everywhere. Of course, they are more cost competitive where the resources are great. As we continue to bring down the average cost, for example, our solar cost goal is 2 cents a kilowatt hour by 2030, that average goal, we increase the geographic area where solar and wind are cost competitive. And it's critical to have multiple options in as many parts of the country as possible. The third area is increasing flexibility in grid services, both from generation and load. That involves both increasing the flexibility and the ability that we have to alter the generation from variable resources like wind and solar. It also means understanding how much storage we need on the system and ensuring it can get built, manufactured, built, and deployed. And it means ensuring that we have firm, dispatchable, flexible resources to fill in any seasonal mismatches and ensure that the last 10, 20% of the system are still fully clean, affordable, and reliable. And lastly, we need to support the modernization of the grid itself. That both means building out more, including transmission, and also improving our ability to visualize and to control power flow on the grid in real time. Lastly, we need to do all of this while ensuring resilient, diversified supply chains, and while maximizing for the US domestic jobs in both manufacturing and in operations and in installation of technologies. So now I'll talk very quickly about how some of those broad goals play and are translated into individual technologies. These are a couple examples of technologies, but we cover wind, solar, geothermal, hydropower, CSP as well. So I'll talk about utility scale solar, offshore wind, and geothermal briefly. For solar, as I said, actually it's not here. I said our goal is 2 cents a kilowatt hour. What that means is a goal to install an average of 30 gigawatts of capacity a year between now and 2025, and 60 gigawatts a year between 2025 and 2030. And that's that accelerated deployment that we're here to talk about today. But in order to achieve that, we need to cut the cost of utility scale solar on average by 60%, which would make utility scale solar the least expensive option for new generation anywhere in the United States. At the same time, we have working to provide job growth, ensuring that we have both good paying, stable jobs in the solar sector and a well-trained, diverse workforce to meet those jobs and meet the needs of those jobs. And lastly, as you see here, prioritizing energy and environmental justice, ensuring that people have equitable access to renewable energy technologies, particularly with rooftop solar, ensuring, for example, that there is just as much opportunity for those who don't own their own homes to access the benefits of rooftop solar or community solar facilities, as well as ensuring utility scale projects are designed in a way where the benefits flow to the local communities in an equitable way. Moving on to a different technology, to offshore wind. That's at a very different stage from and state from solar photovoltaics. We're seeing a burgeoning interest in offshore wind in the US, a really growing interest. You see the number of projects that are in various stages of project development and permitting just on the east coast of the US here on the right. We have developed a government-wide goal of deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Right now, we have about 45 megawatts. So that is effectively starting from zero and hoping we can unlock over 100 gigawatts of offshore deployment by 2050. This means both fixed bottom offshore, which will be most common on the East Coast, but it also means ensuring that we make floating offshore work that is critical for the West Coast of the United States, as well as the far Northeast, the state of Maine, for those who know American geography. Incumbent upon making our offshore wind goals work is not just the deployment, but it's also building up the logistics and the supply chain, as well as domestic manufacturing for offshore wind turbines, which are, as my wind team never stops reminding me, the newest offshore wind turbines are the biggest rotational devices ever built by humankind. And getting them where they need to be, building them, getting them where they need to be requires new logistical solutions that we haven't necessarily built yet or fully understood the best way to accomplish. The last technology specific that I'll talk about is geothermal. We have a large geothermal program that's focused in two different areas. One is on expanding the potential for geothermal to contribute to the electricity system. And this is largely through in the suite of technologies that we call enhanced geothermal systems. That is focused on increasing the ability to extract heat from areas where the subsurface geology may not allow us to do it with stability right now. And that would allow us to expand geothermal electricity production potentially to 60 gigawatts, or capacity, I should say, from 60 gigawatts, possibly even to 100 gigawatts, where right now we are at about 4 gigawatts in the US. We also, just as important for geothermal, is the direct heat side. For example, we have a goal to support the decarbonization of buildings by installing upwards of 17, 18,000 geothermal district heating systems. And our analysis has shown we could install up to 28 million geothermal heat pumps in domestic residences nationwide by 2050. So now I've spoken about 3 specific technologies, and now I want to talk just at the end about 2 areas that cut across all of them in a little bit more depth. The first is ensuring, as we transition to a largely renewable and fully clean grid, that we do so in a way that ensures the reliable, affordable operation of the power system, because it looks very different, obviously, a power system that is based on variable resources and power electronic-based resources. We, together with our partners across the department, we run what we call the grid modernization initiative that has a number of pillars, including renewable energy integration, which is ensuring the reliable operation of the power system with high levels of renewables, high levels of power electronics, expanding grid infrastructure, particularly on the transmission side. In order to get anywhere near the goals that we have, we know significantly expanding interregional transmission is a key element of doing that in the most affordable way. Accommodating widespread electrification, I spoke about this early on, but really beginning to integrate some of our load planning, understanding the planning for both the aggregate, but also the timing for the electrification of vehicles in different areas, the flexibility of that load, the ability of price of different rates and different rate designs to affect when, for example, people are likely to charge their vehicles. These are things that we don't know very well yet, and significant science and research is still needed, as well as demonstrations, to be able to understand that and incorporate it into planning in an effective way. And lastly, to ensure the power system stays reliable and resilient, not only as the system itself changes, but as the threats to the system change. So focus very much on understanding how climate change and other natural changes are likely to affect the resilience and affect the threats that the power system sees. Those can be short-term immediate threats, such as extreme weather events. They can also be longer-term threats, for example, changes in water flows, both the aggregate and the seasonal timing of water flows that are critical both to the hydropower system in the west of the US, as well as to the existing, any generator, obviously, that needs cooling. And also, of course, man-made threats, particularly cyber threats. We have a new division within DOE focused explicitly on cybersecurity, and that we work very closely with them as well. And lastly, citing permitting and land use challenges. If there's one thing that keeps me up at night, it is understanding how we get 350 million Americans to agree and to be excited about living next to renewable energy infrastructure that's critical for the clean energy transition and reaching our climate goals. Recognizing that the amount of land that this will take is both extensive and it's widespread across the country, covers many different types of communities. And recognizing that to do that, we have many tools that DOE can help support, including data and analysis, helping create processes that empower communities and give them a say in the design and the siting of projects, research, of course, to reduce direct impacts on wildlife, both physical impacts on species and habitats, more behavioral science research to ensure that we are designing both systems and individual devices with community interests in mind, and understanding what types of drivers are going to lead to more successful projects there. Translating those into siting strategies and permitting strategies, and also really working closely with our federal partners to maximize the amount of generation that we can get equitably and sustainably on public lands. So the last thing I will close out, many people may be aware, the Department of Energy received 62 billion US dollars in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, otherwise known as here as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that was just passed. This is the largest investment in clean energy transmission and the grid in US history. Multiple provisions, for example, looking at grid resilience and providing key resources to states and utilities to upgrade and to harden their infrastructure. Significant funding for clean energy demonstrations, as well as big research hubs, about $8 million, for example, for a hydrogen research hub. Significant amount of money into battery R&D, as well as supply chains, about $6 billion. And many funds to boost low-income energy efficiency and also to advance energy planning in rural and remote communities. So with that, I will close out. I'd be very happy to take any questions. And again, thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, for this very clear overview of the challenges and ambitions in the US. You described well how the cost of especially solar and onshore wind has now come down to a situation where they are the cheapest option. And they're even sometimes now out-competing existing nuclear and fossil fuel power plants, and we see those plants being closed. How is the reaction among the power companies who have to write off their grand assets in nuclear and fossil fuel power plants due to this development? Is there a clear resistance?
Well, I am conscious that I don't work for a power company. I can't necessarily speak for them. I will say I have seen a wide range of reactions. Of course, nobody wants to have to write off an asset. That's not something that businesses like to do. But the level of comfort and the level of ambition, which really go hand in hand. So I should say the level of ambition in transforming the generation mix and the confidence that utilities have the expertise, the systems, the hardware, the ability to do so in a way that keeps the lights on and keeps their rates down, that differs wildly across the US. And it's important to recognize we have utilities, everything from 10,000 and more employees, many much more utilities across 3-4 states that are vertically integrated, all the way to small cooperatives that are owned with 2, 3, 4 staff in small towns across rural America. And so the level of both understanding and capacity and, of course, priorities differs widely across all of them.
Yeah. The US contribution to the development of solar electricity is clear, and the ambition to reduce costs have been fulfilled with a significant effort in the US. One area where the US now has ambitions, but where the European cost development seem to be ahead of the US, is the offshore wind sector. You described the scale of the US development as a few a few hundred megawatts so far, but the ambition is several gigawatt, and we are in the gigawatt scale in Europe already, and we've seen cost coming down quite fast. What's the cost situation currently in the US, and how do you expect cost to come down? What mechanism will you use, and what rate do you expect?
I do expect costs to come down. Right now, as I said, the current capacity is less than a gigawatt, substantially less, but our goal is to reach 30 gigawatts by 2030. I think largely it's an issue of scale in the US. We just don't have the manufacturing. We don't have the supply chain set up. I think that is going to change quickly. As you saw, we have about 30 or 40 projects in the development pipeline right now. We recognize that we certainly have the manufacturing capability in the US. So it's, there's part of it is the technology, of course. And for floating offshore, there is still quite a bit of work to do to reduce the costs. But there's a big element of cost reduction that hasn't translated into the US that is around the economies of scale.
Yeah. And the mechanism you're using, is that procurement of these sites or auctions? What kind of driving force?
So that depends. The U.S. is very federalized. Every state has a different mechanism, and so most of them are state auctions. The additional complication is, of course, having to lease in the U.S. the offshore site, and that usually comes from the federal government. So you both have the off-taker for the power is usually a local utility. The operators of the auctions depend state to state. But there's also a federal element, again, because you're in the ocean.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alejandro, and good luck with carrying out the plans that you just described.
Thank you for having me. And
thank you. We'll now go on to Amory Lubbins, who has joined us at previous conferences and who is good at describing how the combination of renewables with energy efficiency can make this transition even cheaper and more competitive with the conventional energy system. So I would hand over the screen to Amory. The screen is yours. We cannot hear you, but we see your slides. We saw your slides. Now we see something else.
Okay, can you now see and hear me?
I can now see your slide and hear you.
You can. Okay. Good.
You can. Please go on.
Ohayou gozaimasu, Robinson Emeritus. Thank you for the honor of letting me describe some astonishing energy surprises that Japan must choose whether to lead with great advantage or to chase from behind with great disadvantage. These surprises are in both efficient energy use and renewable supply. The United States now uses 60% less energy than in 1975 to produce a unit of GDP, outdoing even Japan's impressive savings. As I described here last year, integrative design, optimizing buildings, vehicles, equipment, and factories as whole systems, has meanwhile made the efficiency resource several-fold bigger, yet cheaper, and often with increasing returns. Integrative design is hard only because it's simple, requiring original mind. As Zen master Nanin told his imperious visitor in the Nara period, you must first empty your cup. Fully applying practical, profitable, and proven integrative design methods could make the global economy about 5 times more energy efficient. Much of this potential applies even to Japan, where buildings and vehicles are quite inefficient by international standards. Takanaka's 2015 retrofit of its typical small office in Higashi Kanto saved 72% of its energy without interrupting occupancy. That could be further refined and scaled nationwide. Even Japan's efficient industries have much Kaizen still to do. Last year, I summarized how RMI's latest $50+ billion worth of redesigns typically found about 30 to 60% energy savings on retrofit. Our new build projects generally found 40 to 90+% savings with lower than normal capital cost. Just making pipes and ducts fat, short, and straight, rather than skinny, long, and crooked, could save up to 1/5 of the world's electricity, but that's not yet in any official study or climate model. We can also save the energy-intensive materials that industry makes. Just smarter structural design can save at least half of the cement and steel that release 15% of global CO2. Substituting tension for compression structures typically gives better strength, aesthetics, and cost with 1/8 the tons. Fabric forms permit optimal shapes that can save over half the concrete in common shapes, and then the weight savings compound because you need less strength to hold up less weight. This folded concrete roof, pre-stressed with carbon fiber, is just 4 centimeters thick, but it replaces a 30-centimeter thick steel and concrete slab. It costs less, it's more earthquake resistance, and it saves 3/4 of the cement and all the steel. Floor slabs are about half the total weight of typical mid and high-rise buildings, plus more weight to support them. This rendering of an airy bridge shows how 3D printing can eliminate most of the weight of concrete structures that mostly support themselves, not their payload. Even this beautiful stainless steel bridge was 3D printed. You can also save another 15% of core structural materials, 9% of glazing, 77% of energy, and much time and cost, while increasing net rentable space by a stunning 55%. This 3-for-2 concept designs out a vertical meter plus of mechanical plenum at each story. So 3 stories with a normal 2.8 meter ceiling height fit into the vertical space normally needed for 2 stories. Mechanical systems are designed out or integrated into other building elements. Everything gets better. Cost, complexity, and time fall dramatically. Why would you build any other way? Last year, I showed you Tesla's triple efficiency battery electric truck and this flight tested air taxi that could fly nonstop from Tokyo to Sydney with 1/6 the business jet's operating cost and 1/8 its fuel use. Having now inspected that plane, I think it could transform aviation's business models. Last year, I explained how my popular competitively priced carbon fiber electric car from BMW quadrupled efficiency to 59 kilometers per liter equivalent. This year, 2 even more advanced battery electric hypercars are expected to enter the market, both from firms I advise, but neither yet made of carbon fiber. This 2-seater gets over 146 kilometers per liter equivalent, nearly 3 times Tesla efficiency. So the solar cells on top capture enough energy in Japan to drive about 40 kilometers a day without plugging in. Its Dutch counterpart, Lightyear, is also releasing this year a 5-seat 4-wheel car whose 5 square meters of solar cells and 108 kilometer per liter equivalent efficiency can add about 12 kilometers of range per hour in the sun. So the charging infrastructure that others must pay for, these super efficient vehicles can typically avoid. Now, meanwhile, the electricity revolution includes shifting from molecules and atoms to bits and packets, from hardware to software, from hierarchies to networks. Electricity is changing from centralized, supply-focused, fossil and uranium-fueled and brittle to distributed, customer-focused, renewable, and resilient. The grid is becoming decarbonized, decentralized, digital, and democratized. Customers are figuring out that they can buy fewer electrons, use them more productively and timely, produce their own, and even trade them with each other. It's wise to sell customers what they want before someone else does. So powerful disruptors are converging on the electricity industry from at least 8 directions. These 8 Pac-Men of the apocalypse move fast. They don't just add, they exponentiate. They're not lone wolves, they hunt in packs, they multiply quickly, and they can gobble half of utility revenues in this decade. Together, they're creating an alien competitive landscape faster than most utility cultures can cope. 8 years ago, all central power plants were called dinosaurs. Too big, too inflexible, not even relevant for backup power in the long run. Who said that? Not Greenpeace, but Union Bank of Switzerland. And now a new wave of Pac-Men is coming into view. Leading financial advisory firm Lazard confirms that solar and wind power in green now outcompete gas or coal power, the bottom two bars, or nuclear power, the red bar, often beating just the operating costs, as Thomas said. I've added in aqua at the bottom, US utilities' typical costs of customers' electric efficiency, credited in blue for avoiding remote sources, delivery costs and losses because efficiency is already delivered. Japan's rooftop solar has cost less than grid power since 2014, but utility scale solar and wind still cost twice world norms. Just in 2020, China added nearly twice as much solar and wind capacity as Japan has ever built cumulatively. If Japan's utilities keep burning so much fossil fuel, Japanese firms won't be eligible to compete for global business where supply chains require decarbonization. But real competition, unleashing Japan's industrial and innovative power, could make clean and secure electricity abundant and affordable. The main obstacle is central government policies that help incumbents stifle competition to protect their legacy assets, making Japan's electricity costlier and less resilient, and the whole economy less competitive. Policy focus on not on winners, but on losers. Nuclear restarts with no apparent business case. Worldwide, though, the transformation is accelerating. The blue curve showing modern renewables, all renewables except big hydro dams, grew faster in the past decade than the magenta nuclear curve ever grew 4 decades ago. Total renewables in green now outproduce nuclear power by threefold, have surpassed gas-fired generation in orange, should soon exceed coal-fired generation in white, and continue to speed up, though temporarily outrun by last year's post-pandemic demand surge. In 2020, renewables added 782 times more capacity, or about 232 times more expected annual output than net nuclear additions, which then tipped into shrinkage. That's game over. In contrast, coal-dependent Vietnam at the end of 2018 had 0.1 gigawatts of solar power. 2 years later, it had 16.5 gigawatts, the most in East Asia, a third more than the 2025 target set months before, and enough to generate a fourth of the nation's electricity once the grid catches up. 9 of that 16 gigawatts was on 100,000 rooftops or similar structures, equivalent to building half the nation's coal plants in a year, and 72% of those were installed just in the month of December, mostly in the last week before a 9-month window closed for the juicy feed-in tariff. This revolution, almost all privately financed, then stalled last year when the tariff wasn't renewed, but its speed is inspiring East Asian neighbors, except apparently Japan. But what the International Energy Agency calls the cheapest bulk power source on Earth, photovoltaics, is still often misanalyzed. The left graph's violin plots show that even the IPCC's 2018 climate report relied mainly on old predictions of low solar output. But the 2 red bars predict 3 to 10 times more by letting observed learning curves, lower price with higher volume, actually operate within the models. The second graph shows that PV since 1976 had a 23% learning or experience curve, as most models still assume. But in the past 15 years, that jumped to 40%. The third graph shows that many integrated assessment models assume PVs will cost more in 2050 than they did cost in 2019. And that in 2019 or 20, they cost up to 6 times their actual market price. The fourth graph shows how using solar power's actual market prices and behaviors predicts in red the nearly 100% renewable electricity by 2050. but climate policy still mainly relies on the gray theoretical models. 5 years ago, I showed you a simulation of 100% renewable electricity for the 2050 Texas grid, which has no big hydro dams and is only 1% interconnected to the rest of the US. A summer week's expected loads can get much smaller and less peaky with profitably efficient use. Then we can make 86% of the annual electricity with wind and solar cells and 14% from dispatchable renewables. This 100% renewable supply can then match the load, the dashed line, by putting surplus electricity into two kinds of distributed storage worth buying anyway: ice storage, air conditioning, and smart charging of electric automobiles, and then recovering that stored energy when needed and filling the last gaps with unobtrusively flexible demand. Then you have 100% renewable electricity every hour of the year with no bulk storage and with only about 5% left over to help decarbonize other sectors. So the economics should be excellent even at today's prices. Some grid operators now do such choreography every day. Germany, Britain, Ireland are half renewably powered. Denmark expects to be 86% renewably powered last year. Scotland, 100%, we're waiting for the data. Already, they and some other European countries with modest or no hydropower meet about half to 3/4 or more of their annual electricity needs from renewables. Yet they added no bulk storage and they have superior reliability. The 99.999% reliable former East German utility, 50 Hertz, was 62% renewably powered in 2021 and targets 100% renewables, all reliably integrated, by 2032. So as my colleague Clay Stranger says, the operators have learned to run these grids the way the conductor leads the Tokyo Symphony. No instrument plays all the time, but the ensemble continuously makes beautiful music. Some Japanese utilities claim even 40 or 50% supply by variable renewables is impossible. Yet in 2020, the maximum percentage of Germany's electricity demand met by variable renewables, PVs plus wind power, shown as red dots, exceeded 50% almost every week and ranged from 80% to nearly 100% in about half of all weeks. Nuclear and coal phase outs continued, the lights stayed on. The same ultra-reliable German grid operator and its Belgian counterpart just analyzed Europe's long, calm, cloudy periods. These need backup power for only up to a week or two per year, totaling about 6% of winter electricity use, using just existing gas-fired capacity, burning green molecules like hydrogen made at other times from surplus solar and wind. The often claimed need for months or seasons of storage was not found, partly because this study included efficient use, electric vehicle integration, heat pumps, behind-the-meter home batteries, and demand response that by itself could cut renewable power's under or oversupply days by 90%. Another big grid balancing resource is grid-connected parked automobiles, whose storage and ancillary services are already being profitably sold to European grids. Electric auto sales are soaring as battery costs plummet. Each trend drives the other. In 2021, plug-in cars' global market share doubled in a year to over 10%, with 15% of Chinese and 10% of European auto sales versus Japan's 1%. Within the next few years, electric cars will cost no more to buy than gasoline cars, yet they're much nicer and cheaper to drive. Their dominance and abundant cheap batteries for all imply distributed solar everywhere, gas industry distress, the end of thermal power plants, vast distributed storage and demand flexibility, and perhaps much of the grid's becoming a stranded asset like phone company copper. This prospect gives utility executives nightmares and venture capitalists sweet dreams. Reliable power from renewables is manageable because we have not just one way, bulk storage in Magenta, but about 10 carbon-free ways to make the grid flexible, reliable, and renewable, sketched here in rough order of increasing cost. Their actual costs will vary, but bulk storage comes last, not first. so we need not wait for a storage miracle, though some are emerging, and the market isn't waiting. The two left-hand boxes are especially large. Reinventing Fire showed that quadrupling US electric end-use efficiency could cost 10 times less than the electricity it saves. So more than 3/4 of today's use could be profitably saved if we competed or compared efficiency against supply. Flexawatts, the second box in that chart, also look about 3 times bigger than expected. RMI's hourly simulation for Texas systematically combined 8 kinds of demand response that shape loads, and together these can conveniently cut the summer daily load range nearly in half, save 24% of non-renewable capacity, make renewable energy 36% more valuable, and repay their own costs in about 5 months. 14 years of experiments with time-dependent electricity pricing on 3 continents, plus technical demand response, demonstrated peak load reductions above 30 to 50%, even without today's electric vehicles and other new technical options. Making existing buildings more energy efficient can reduce and shift their peak demand. Alejandro Moreno described. A new analysis by the US National Renewable Energy Lab competing efficiency against storage conservatively shows this strategy can reduce investments by an order of magnitude, by 97% in the region with a Japan-like climate, by displacing long-duration hydrogen storage and green electricity to make it. An important Oxford paper clearly frames a powerful transition strategy. Real energy costs since 1880 in the first graph have long been about flat, but fell steeply for major renewables, driving their rapid growth in the second graph. Yet almost the entire literature is unmoored from actual market prices. The third graph's inset histogram at the top shows that nearly 3,000 standard model runs predicted solar power costs in 2010 to 2020 would fall at a speed averaging 2.6% per year, and at best under 6% per year. But the actual was 15% per year. The most optimistic forecasts in these models, or IEAs, graphed as downward sloping colored lines, assumed far slower cost drops than observed. The fourth graph shows how diverse models further assumed that solar costs could not fall below certain floor levels, the green lines, which actual markets cheerfully blasted right through one after another. Such theoretical models, though, still drive global climate policy. Instead, the Oxford paper, even without faster energy savings, finds that simply using actual market prices and behaviors makes renewable power by far the cheapest option, and the faster you buy it, the cheaper it gets. Discount rate doesn't matter. Economic theorists have spent decades debating trade-offs that don't actually exist. Finally, 5 years ago, I used this 13-year transformation from the first car to the last horse to illustrate the breathtaking speed of the energy transformation led by insurgents, not incumbents. Investors flee even before customers do, because capital markets quickly discover disruption and shift capital from losers to winners. Already, trillions of dollars have prudently fled the fossil fuel industry as it hemorrhages capital, talent, and political influence. The world's top 16 listed hydrocarbon companies combined were recently worth less than Apple. Tesla was worth more than all other significant automakers combined. Carbon Tracker investment analyst, now RMI strategist Kingsmill Bond, explains this brutal logic. He says any fast-growing challenger will rapidly take all the growth in a slow-growing market. As a rule of thumb, incumbent sales will peak when the challenger gets to about 3% market share, as in these examples. That's because most investors seek growth, not mere size, and they try to sell just before sales peak, stagnation strands assets, and competition drops prices. With peak nuclear power, probably coal use, automobile sales, and fossil power have already happened. The pandemic crushed fossil fuel use, but renewables accelerated greatly. So by the time demand recovers and economies re-equilibrate, renewables will probably have expanded enough to supply any future growth. IEA forecasts over 90%, tipping fossil fuels into permanent decline. Therefore, peak oil, peak fossil fuels, and peak CO2 emissions probably all happened in 2019. If that turns out to be not quite true, it won't be by much. Renewables now win $0.4 trillion of annual investment, efficiency $0.3 trillion, and they're strongly synergistic. Efficient use makes renewables gain share faster, while efficiency outcompetes fossil fuels sooner. In such a typhoon, utilities could just hang on, choosing to be not a midwife for new technologies, but a mortician for old ones, and trying to maximize shareholder value while managing decline. This may work for some players for some time, but it's not much fun, and it's ever more vulnerable to their weakening financial and political position. Utilities that want to survive and thrive will need to provide the services customers want with the prices and resilience they need, and stop clinging to legacy assets that should really enter hospice for an orderly and compassionate terminal phase, so that newer, cheaper, more dynamic, more climate effective options can contest their grid capacity and their market space. Thank you all for your good work and your kind attention. ご清聴誠にありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Amory, for this very dense presentation of real-world commercial opportunities. And the question every time I hear you is, why is this clever, intelligent options not used? Can you answer that simply?
Well, I think I gave a lot of evidence it actually is used in many places.
Yeah.
And I think it must be used in Japan. You have everything it takes to do it except central government policy. You have all the skills, all the public desire, all the economic logic, but the incumbents still stand in the way. And that is not sustainable for them or for the country.
So the economic benefits and the strive of the investors is going in this direction unless blocked by policies. That's the main obstacle as you see it.
Yes, and yet we see at the provincial and city level and in household choices, many countervailing choices that have managed to build quite a lot of solar power, even though wind continues to be pretty thoroughly suppressed because it's the most formidable competitor to the thermal plants. But I think the great shakeup now happening in the world and in perceptions of energy security may also help to accelerate the emerging public and business leadership that I think will clear these obstacles. And I have the sense that in the Japanese way of making big change, the tectonic plates are moving under the surface, and we'll rather soon get to the point where the policy earthquake happens and then everybody cheerfully goes off in the new direction with no regrets, something Penn can do uniquely well that the West cannot.
Right. Thank you very much for that optimistic conclusion. We're now going to hear from two other major countries in the world, from China and India. And first, I would like to give the screen to Li Yunfeng from China, from the National Center for Climate Change Strategy and International Cooperation. Li Yunfeng, the floor is, or the screen is yours.
Okay. So everyone, and very glad to be here and participate the 2020 revisions. I dislike another two colleagues. They prepared very good kind of PPT for the presentations. With the short notice, I do not prepare any PPT, but I give the introduction for the progress of China renewable energy development and with their target for the carbon reductions. Since the 2020, our President Xi Jinping make announcement in United Nations conference, he proposed that China will be emission peak by 2030 of CO2 and 2060 the kind of a carbon neutral. After such kind of announcement, China government make quite a lot of policy instrument and planning, include energy planning. They set up very clear short-term, long-term, and mid-term targets for the kind of renewable energies. For the long term, the longest is by 2060, China's non-fossil fuels, the proportion will be increased from a current 16% to more than 80%. That means with about 64% increasing within less than 40 years.
We cannot see. We can't see your face for some reason.
Oh, what's the problem? Let me see. Okay.
We see a green screen, not you. Now something happened.
Okay, I'm not sure what's wrong here.
Okay. We will have to do with your voice alone. Please continue.
Okay, I'm not sure. Just before it's okay, I'm not sure what's the problem. But you can hear me. It's okay.
We can hear you well.
Okay, that's I just finished my speech. And in the short term, is by 2025, the non-fossil fuels proportion will be 20%. 2030 will be about 25%. So for reach this target, the Chinese government proposed to set up the kind of a new power system with kind of non-fossil fuels, mainly kind of by hydro, wind, and solar. In order to reach such a target, we set up such kind of a mid-term target by 2030. Chinese wind and solar install capacity will be not less than 1,200 gigawatt. That means now every year I have 100 gigawatt should be installed. 100 gigawatts every year should be installed. Last year we finished about 120 gigawatts. So that's no problem. We reach the target for 1,200 gigawatt by 2030. Most of the people believe by 2030, solar and wind, the installation will be increased into about 1,500 to 1,800 gigawatt. It's a little bit higher than our USA friends. My USA friends said they are from now to 2025 is every year 30 gigawatt of solar, and 2026 to 2030 is 60 gigawatt. China may be a little bit more than that, almost double. Since last year we have near 6 gigawatt of solar to be installed, 55 gigawatt of wind to be installed. So almost a little bit double of the USA. Since we have almost double the kind of power generation. So last year, our power generation is about 850 trillion hours, almost equals double of the USA power generation, equals even with a kind of the total of EU and USA. So that's the very huge the kind of effort. But we are certainly we do not have such kind of a clear target. When will be have a natural carbon or the kind of zero carbon emission power systems. Since the EU and the USA have proposed, they have the kind of a carbon neutral power system by 2035. Government do not have such kind of target, but the research institutions they have a lot of projections. Maybe China to be later on, and then USA and the Europeans maybe like 2040 or 2045, China have the carbon free of power systems. Since we have by 2060, the non-fossil fuels will be more than 85. That means the kind of power generation, in the power generation, the non-fossil fuels will be increased more than 90 or 95%. That's the current studies. For support this one, we also try to set up the kind of manufacturing industries. As you know, China has the biggest solar PV manufacturers, also biggest the kind of wind power manufacturers. Include this kind of international companies working in China. For example, the wind, like GE and Siemens, Gamesa, all of them, they working in China. But they are wind turbines probably export to everywhere. And also the solar PV, Chinese supply the solar PV panels more than 100 countries. Since China not only develop such industry service for ourselves, they also for the world to reach the kind of carbon neutral power systems. Internally, China have strongly have the limitation to control the coal consumptions. Recently, just last week, the Energy Administration of Chinese government, they have announced all the newly built the coal power plant is not for power generation, just for the system support to have increasing of the renewable power. That's the bigger change. Since in before the 2021, the coal power generation is still the major, one of the major power generation support. So since now China's coal power plant is not for power generation, it's only for the kind of system support for more renewables. The reason is that China, dislike European and USA, we mainly for the thermal power systems were mainly from coal, and not natural gas. Natural gas is quite expensive in China, so they are trying to make the kind of we could ratify of the coal power plant to have more renewables. That's the Chinese current situation. Also, the Chinese kind of manufacturing installations of renewables also supply the quite a lot, the kind of investment and employment. For the older power generation companies, more than half of their capacity is from renewables. The highest one is more than 60% or 70%. And our government have such kind of planning target. By 2030, more than 75 of power generation systems will be come from renewables, and 50% of power generation will be from renewables. Currently, we only have 30 or 35%. So we have more than 30 or 25 or 30% to increasing. That means we have the newly increasing the employment and the installation of the system mainly from the renewables. That means they have not only have the cost, also supply a lot of benefit for the employment. Quite a lot of the kind of the western part of the cities, they have set up the kind of a new manufacturing capacity for solar. For example, in Xinjiang, in Yunnan, in the other the kind of western part of the country. So I think that they're very important. Another thing is the Chinese very pay quite a lot of attention for international cooperation. Since the carbon neutral is not only the one country target, it's the whole world, not only China, not only Japan, not only USA, European, but it's United Nations target. So we need kind of cooperation. Also for the carbon neutral, every country have almost the similar kind of technologies, similar kind of pathway, similar kind of system. So we need to learn each other and help each other or to cooperate to each other. That's very important. Since majorly for the in the future for the contribution of energy transition and energy production, mainly from solar and wind. Both IEA and IRENA have a very clear target by 2050 reach the carbon neutral. Solar and wind should be 65 to 70% of the power generation. That's a similar target. So we need to cooperate, work together, find a good way at the kind of lowest cost, reach the kind of carbon neutral of power systems and energy productions. That's my short presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Li Yunpeng. We heard a lot of numbers that I think would have been lovely to have on a table or on a screen. But while you describe the ambition and the rapid increase of renewable deployment in China, it's interesting. It would be interesting to hear something about how the cost competitiveness has developed in China. We heard in the US that solar and wind were often the cheapest source of electricity and sometimes outcompeting conventional sources. But what's the situation in China? How is solar PV electricity competing with new coal-fired power stations in electricity generating cost?
Inside China, since 2021, all the solar power generation is cheaper than the coal already. Since last year, the coal cost the increase quite a lot. In the average, Chinese solar PV production cost is kind of 30 fen, almost the kind of like that's $4. $4. But the coal power generation, the average is $6 to $8 due to the kind of locations. So I think the solar is cheaper now. Wind even more cheaper. It's much cheaper than the solar and the coal. So I think that we reached the target already. We call the parallel the kind of production of solar and wind.
Okay, we will have time for more discussion later, but I would first like to hand over the screen to Ajay Mathur. Good to see you. I haven't seen you for many years, but nice to see you again. And please give us your introduction.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Thomas. Yes, it's many years since we have met, but I'm glad that we are reacquainting with you and with the entire REI. It's also a pleasure to hear Amory. It's wonderful to hear his views on where we are moving. He has been proven right so many times in the past, and we are looking forward to moving ahead in the future, particularly in the area of energy efficiency. I think that Amory has been a leader, and I see him doing the same thing as far as renewable energy is concerned. What I'd like to do, Thomas, is to share a short presentation on where things are as far as India is concerned. I will, if you give me a moment, I'll load my screen. Okay, here it goes. I hope you can see the screen, and here it goes into the full screen mode. Right. Thomas, can you see the screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So what I'd like to focus on are two key elements. First is renewable energy is growing and growing fast. We have seen that in the past few years in India, and more importantly in the world, because the global movement has obviously influenced the Indian movement and vice versa, we see that the pledges that have been created by world leaders to move to net zero now cover approximately 70% of the global GDP and CO2 emissions, which implies a political commitment to moving towards a focus on renewable energy. We do note that as far as current policies are concerned, we would still be at a 2.7 degrees above the industrial levels by 2100. But with the net zero transition, we should be able to cap it at about 1.7 degrees, if not 1.5. But this implies that the electricity that is provided to the vast numbers of people in the world, including all those who have very limited energy access, is from renewable energy with no carbon emissions. It obviously has helped that global installation costs for renewable energy have decreased to the point that we have had a sharp decline in the prices of renewable energy in India and across the world. And I think, as the previous speakers have spoken, we are today at the point where in most geographies around the world, renewable electricity, wind, solar, in many countries, hydro is the cheapest form of electricity, but when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. The challenge is that we make this the energy source of choice round the clock. Emery had presented the range of options that are there for providing electricity and from renewables at times when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. It is this integration that we believe is where the current challenges lie. I would like to point out that at Paris, or before Paris, when India had submitted its nationally determined contributions, we had said that 40% of our capacity, electricity generation capacity, would be from renewable energy or non-fossil fuel energy by 2030, and that the carbon intensity of the economy would decline by 33 to 35%. We see that as having been happened in the early months of 2022. So this is a positive sign. We are, however, as I said earlier, based on the fact that over the years we've grown from a system in which the initial growth of renewables was pushed by the requirements for the renewable portfolio obligations that created a demand, and that the feed-in tariff in the early years provided a remuneration to the renewable energy suppliers. But over a period of time, we have seen that feed-in tariff changed to auctions and then to reverse auction. And as a result, the renewable energy capacity, both in terms of capacity and in terms of the electricity that is sold, has grown fast. To answer a question, Thomas, that you had presented to Mr. Lee, the price of solar electricity in India is somewhere in the 3.5 US cents per kilowatt hour. That's where we are today. It is much cheaper than the coal-based electricity at 5 cents plus per kilowatt hour. And as was mentioned, this is now cheaper than the variable cost of coal electricity. Nevertheless, the greatest problem lies at night when the demand is still increasing. So every year we see the night demand and the day demand increase at about 3 to 4% a year. Now, if in the next 4 years we are not able to provide round the clock renewable electricity, then it would mean that we would need to add fossil fuel based electricity. That obviously is not in anyone's interest, not in India's interest, not in the world interest. It's not in India's interest because you will have created capacity which will create stranded assets relatively soon. We will also create local pollution apart from global pollution, which adds to the challenges of managing urban areas, particularly with the kinds of environmental quality that people need and accept. We are therefore looking at what are the kinds of ways in which round the clock renewable electricity can be managed in the next 2 or 3 years, 2022, 2023, 2024. This obviously leads to a large number of challenges. One of those challenges is obviously what do we do at when the sun is not shining. Obviously, the range of options are there. We are obviously hoping that storage batteries become cost effective. We expect that a 20 to 25% reduction in the cost of batteries, which we expect will happen in 1 or 2 years, will make them cost effective. In other words, solar during the day, stored in batteries during the night, would provide cost effective electricity even when the sun is not shining. But the other opportunity that we see is regional interconnections. So we have got regional grids. You've got the grid in the Gulf countries, you've got the grid in Asia, and in the middle is India. So for example, if the Indian grid is connected to the ASEAN grid, with what it means is that when it is night in Japan, it is a still day in India. And an interconnection between the Indian grid and the ASEAN grid, which extends all the way from Myanmar to Japan, could provide solar electricity from India on to Japan. And similarly, when it is night in Japan, in India, when it is night in India, the solar electricity from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, could flow to India. In other words, interconnection between the Gulf region and India on the one side, and between India and ASEAN on the other side, and similarly between North Africa and Europe, between West Africa and East Africa, could help provide solar electricity, so that the optimization that is done at the level of utilities is not just of internal management, but also of external electricity trade. In other words, countries would invest in solar electricity, not only for their use, but also for the purposes of sharing or selling that electricity to other geographies to their east as the sun as the sun sets in the eastern countries, and consequently there is a potential for non-carbon based electricity to provide electricity in areas where the sun is no longer shining, or where wind at that point of time is not happening. We are therefore looking at opportunities between regional entities to see how these connections can be enabled. Thomas, I would end here, but I would be very, very happy to move ahead with discussions on key issues on enabling a carbon-free future in the electricity world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I find it encouraging to see that now, having listened to speakers from the 3 large parts of the world, from US, China, and India, that we hear reports of good progress and even higher ambitions. But Ajay Mathur, when you described the challenges, you seemed not to use all the opportunities that Amory described on how to manage the 24/7 balanced electricity grid. Are not those opportunities with choreographing the different renewable energy sources and the better control of demand and the simplest storage methods by pushing demand earlier or later that Amory described, aren't they just as applicable in India?
Yes, they are. Thomas, you and I worked closely together on energy efficiency. And one of the key impacts that has happened is that the growth of electricity, remember, India is a country where we have not yet been able to provide adequate electricity to all at affordable prices. This was growing at more than 5%. Electricity demand was growing at more than 5% a year. Because of energy efficiency, it's declined to about 3.5%. It can decrease further, but those are efforts that are underway as we speak. So India, for example, has the innovative energy saving certificates provided to energy intensive industries if they are able to reduce their specific energy consumption beyond a mandated level. So yes, energy efficiency is clearly one of the main drivers of managing the resources. The second is matching and mixing the various renewable energy sources, in particular hydro. And one of the major areas that we are working is the mix of solar and wind on the one side with hydroelectricity on the other side. This works out extremely well, and given the fact that in populous countries such as India, land is an issue, we are looking at reservoirs behind dams to have floating solar plants. Now, you have the grid connections at the hydroelectricity plants in the first place. Those facilities are very easily used to carry solar electricity during the day and hydroelectricity during the night. So there are a number of very large floating solar plants that have been established. But you realize, of course, that this is very geography specific, it's location specific. We will come out with larger numbers, hopefully by the third quarter of this year. But yes, you are absolutely right. The answer will be based on a number of issues. What we wanted to say was there will be energy efficiency, there will be a mix of renewable sources, there will be batteries, and there will be inter-regional connections. All of this will enable us to meet the demands when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing.
Thank you. Now I would like to see Amory and Li Yunfeng also on the screen, and you can switch your microphones on and intervene. What I would like to bring into the discussion now is the distinction in deploying solar at this usually called utility scale, as being large, often ground-based solar plants, compared to the decentralized rooftop installations and very decentralized, not grid-connected solar installations that you see in Africa and in parts of India as well. And in Japan, the institutional barriers to large-scale solar did not apply to the rooftop, so you can see that quicker. What's the share of solar installations in India, for example, that are decentralized rooftops, maybe not even grid connected, compared to the utility scale installations?
So as far as the utility-based installations are concerned, there's something like 70% of the solar. The non-utility connections, rooftops which are still grid connected, are something of the order of 15, 17, 18%, something of that sort. Mm-hmm. And non-grid connected are somewhere in the 10 to 12% range. So there is a huge effort to enhance solar, particularly for pumping reasons. That would ultimately be the sector where non-grid connected solar would lie. Though recently the utility companies have been directed that they should provide connections to solar pumps as well, so that when the solar pump is not being used for water, that electricity can be used by the grid. This helps greatly in providing voltage stabilization and electricity, cheap electricity in rural areas. I'll give you an example. In the state of Maharashtra, when the electricity company takes electricity from the grid to a rural substation, it costs 7.48 rupees per kilowatt hour. But on the same location, they have given out a contract to a third party which sets up a solar plant and sells them solar electricity, obviously during the day, at 3 rupees a kilowatt hour. So 3 rupees and 7.48, huge difference, but it makes economic sense. So what we are seeing is that in areas where we see a convergence of the interests of users and economic interests, there are changes that are happening as we speak.
One of the reasons for that in the United States, where we also have quite a lot of distributed generation with solar, is resilience, because 98 or 99% of our power failures originate in the grid. If you have solar on your roof and a behind the meter battery with its 13 kinds of benefits that make it cost effective even 8 years ago, then you don't really worry about the grid. My house works with or without the grid. I had one power failure in 25 years when a battery cell failed. But you know, I live up in the mountains. We have storms, things happen to the wires. And when I see on the news that there's a blackout in my area, I go outside and look. Sure enough, my neighbor's lights are off. And then I come back in and watch the news some more to see when my neighbor's lights will come back on. But this is something I think people will increasingly want in a world with more erratic weather, with attacks on grids. And I think the other key to what you just described is integrating efficiency in all uses. I gave an Indian example. I love your example of the of solar farmers who can use their solar power for irrigation. But first, it's possible by doing an end-to-end retrofit with a payback certainly under 2 years, probably under 1 today, to save something over 80% of the electricity used for irrigation pumping. This means better pumps, better controls, better pipes, better distribution. And I'm not even counting higher value crops, but just kilowatt hours per each drop of water delivered. Well, in that case, far more farmers, smallholders especially, can adopt solar far quicker. Much less capital is needed. Or in a household in India, if you adopt the superefficiency.org, the SEAD program of a 25-watt household with super efficient appliances, then you double the capital productivity. You can electrify twice as many houses with the same money. And then there's the broader lesson that if you invest in things that save electricity whenever that's cheaper than making it, rather than in supply, you need about 1,000th as much capital. You get it back 10 times as fast. Therefore, you need on the order of 10,000 times less capital for the power sector, which eats a quarter of global development capital. Freeing up that capital for other development needs would be the most powerful lever we know for global economic development.
Emery, when you describe the resilience of those decentralized solar and battery installations, that should be quite interesting for countries like Japan, where there are typhoons and earthquakes and things like that that disrupt the conventional electricity grid now and then. But how do you get this advantage to be visible in the planning and in the decision making?
Well, it doesn't take very much innovation because modern inverters can typically auto island if allowed to. That is, if the grid goes down, the inverter disconnects from the grid, continues to run your load as best it can. When the grid comes back, it'll wait a bit to make sure it's really there, and then resync and reconnect, all without interrupting the load. We just need to make sure that neither the government nor the utilities prohibit auto islanding. It ought to be the default practice. And the US and I think other countries have national industry standards that will keep the line workers safe. And ours is called IEEE 1547. So making sure that those standards are observed, which is straightforward to do, could build resilience from the bottom up. And we must also be careful very quickly to solarize resiliently our gasoline and diesel filling stations. It's really stupid to make our supply of motor fuel depend on the grid. There's no reason for that. And this means whenever we have a big storm in the US and the wires go down, after a few days, the recovery efforts grind to a halt because nobody can get motor fuel and the gensets die. Well, let's fix that. It's rather cheap and we could do it within months.
Thomas, if I can add to what Amory just said. Way back, maybe 20, 25 years ago, when the grid electricity in India wasn't adequate, most of us, I, for example, at home had batteries and an inverter, as Amory described, which used to come on when the electricity supply went off. I don't use that today. I still have it somewhere, but I don't use it today. But there's no reason why I should, especially as we move towards solar. But to the point of the petrol, the fueling stations, what we are seeing is that now almost 99% of homes and office and businesses are connected to the grid across the country. But it doesn't mean that they get electricity 100% of the time. So what we are seeing is solar mini grids come up. And a very interesting business model is called the ABC model. A is for the anchor load, and typically it's a cell phone tower or something of that sort, who wants 99.9% reliability and therefore is willing to pay the additional rupee in terms of maintaining that supply. B is businesses. This is the petrol filling stations, the local petrol filling stations, the banks, the ATMs, etc., which are then powered, and they also charge a premium rupee on it. And then C are consumers. And with consumers, they have a very interesting model, which is I will provide you electricity for X number of points, which could be lighting points, which could be power points, and so on. And I provide them for 4 or 5 hours at night. And I charge X rupees, typically 1 rupee for every hour of supply. If you convert it into kilowatt hours, it's very expensive. But if you convert it into reliability, people are willing to pay. And we have seen a sudden proliferation of solar mini grids across the country, solar mini grids plus batteries. And batteries are expensive, but it makes economic sense.
Do some of these follow Professor Jhunjhunwala's model of low voltage DC microgrids, where the appliances you run, the solar panels and your batteries are all at the same voltage with no inverter? Is that
not really? No, not really, because you see, these are homes that are connected to the grid and to the mini grid. Okay. So they operate at 220.
But if you're isolated, like his sites in Rajasthan, it's a wonderful model because it roughly doubles efficiency and cuts cost in half.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Li Yunfeng, in China, we would usually imagine everything to be large scale and centrally planned. But what about solar rooftop and decentralized electricity grids in China? Is it happening?
It's happening. In the last year, we are totally installed about near 6 gigawatt of solar panels. More than half is distributed, and 1/3 is rooftop. Also, mainly in the rural area, the rural household, quite a lot of people to install the solar PV on their roof to supply electricity for their own use and to deliver that to the rural industry and other sectors. So China is both, we call it integrated and distributed together. So last year, they also to set up the large planning for the integrated kind of PV system. But in the east part, mainly integrated, but in the west part, mainly integrated, but in the east part, mainly distributed. Like my hometown Shandong, it's mainly distributed. Solar BIPV is the majority is for the installations.
So you have described, all of you, that the cost of solar and wind power has come down. It's scaled up. It is taking over by being more competitive, lower cost than conventional sources. Still, in the climate debate in Europe, for example, we still hear a lot of calls for carbon neutrality rather than renewables, indicating that there are people who still believe that nuclear power will have a role in the climate policy governed electricity development. Amory described it as game over, and when the total cost of solar is cheaper than the operating cost of nuclear in the US and in parts of Europe. But there are still nuclear construction going on in China and India. What are the economic merits of these projects compared to renewables? Ajay,
Well,
is there any nuclear?
I have huge difficulty in figuring out the economic benefits. Economically, nuclear electricity is more expensive than coal, and which is more expensive than solar.
No.
If nuclear power grows, it's only for strategic reasons. It is to reduce the imports. But solar electricity and wind electricity are also able to do that. The other issue is reliability. Solar plants promise 100% or near 100% reliability, which solar and wind by themselves don't, but together with the ensemble, the orchestra, as Emily described it, is quite possible. To me, nuclear will have a place if it is able to address the issue of costs. The small modular reactors that we talk about, if they are able to provide electricity at prices that are competitive, sure, nuclear has a future.
I think Amory would like to comment on the SMRs, but I'd like Li Yunfeng to say something on the economic competitiveness in China, because China is now the country that builds more nuclear reactors than anyone else. Are they competitive cost-wise in China?
This is not really. The Chinese the nuclear power plant is yes, they're still built some, but not very little. Last year, total installation is 200 gigawatt. The nuclear only the 3 gigawatt. It's only the 2 or 3%, very limited. This is just for the nuclear power industry. Like our India friend said, we hope the nuclear power in the future can play very important role for the energy safety, but they need scale up and reduce the reductions, their cost, product cost. However, we do not find the kind of good way how to reduce the cost of nuclear power. Also, the nuclear, the selections of the size also have quite a lot of problem. Like our American friends said, it's very difficult to find a new site to accept it by the public. So China's renewables, no objections, but the nuclear, there's a lot of barrier to be removed for the large scale. You see, even in a longer term, the nuclear still with a very small proportion for energy.
But I saw a couple of years ago that the costs in China for nuclear was also more expensive than coal, as Ajay said in India. Is that true, or is nuclear cheaper than coal power in China?
Usually the nuclear is expensive than coal, but the coal depends on coal price. If the coal, like now we have trouble in the world, Russia and Ukraine, the oil price is going up, the coal price also going up. In this way, the nuclear is cheaper than the coal power generation. But for long term, they are more expensive than the solar and wind. That's the situation.
Okay.
Since all the gas power and the coal power rely on the cost of fuel.
The Bloomberg data are very interesting. They show that China has the world's cheapest nuclear power, but it's still twice as expensive per kilowatt hour as Chinese wind and solar. And I think this is bringing about a shift in government thinking. And you see that in 2020, where the government invested at least as much in renewables as it had cumulatively invested in nuclear over the previous 12 years.
The Chinese nuclear power, the cost is cheaper than other countries like European and the USA. The main reason we do not collect the fee of the ratify the system later on.
Right.
If you include collect this fee, this will be quite more expensive.
I would like to give a rather encouraging example of how quickly things are moving on the power electronic driven grid, like grid forming inverters that Alejandra Moreno mentioned. South Australia is a 1.3 gigawatt grid, mostly isolated. It has a little export capability now. And it has some big batteries and a lot of solar, 70% of it on rooftops. They recently ran entirely on solar for about a day and entirely on solar and wind for 6.5 days, just as Denmark has run for over a day on wind alone. So this rather well proves that these variable renewables with a mixture of storage controls, demand side, can provide reliable electricity without the fossil backup and without any sort of so-called clean firm power.
Ajay mentioned the small modular reactors as something that would remove some of the disadvantages with nuclear, that when one pump fails in a power plant, you lose a gigawatt or so for several days. With small modular reactors, you would be less vulnerable to individual technical failures, and some see that as an advantage. But Amory, you have described the cost issue as much more complicated than that. Can you give a summary?
Yeah, well, first of all, the design like NuScale currently being proposed would share a rather large, hundreds of megawatts steam system, generator and switchyard and so on. So there would be common vulnerabilities. But you see, the economics never made sense for this concept or any like it, leaving aside particular novel safety and proliferation problems of many of these designs. The economics don't work, and I think I can simply explain why. Today's reactors are, according to Lazard and Bloomberg, about 3 to 13 times costlier per kilowatt hour than new solar and wind, unsubsidized. However, the small modular reactors would initially be about twice that expensive because reactors don't scale down well. And it's hoped to make this up with mass production, but by the time you could even think about starting mass production, the renewables will be another twofold cheaper. So if you multiply 2 times 3 to 13 times 2, you discover that you need to get a factor roughly 12 to 52 times cheaper from mass production. And that is completely impossible. Basically, the small modular renewables, which do scale down well, are decades ahead in exploiting their own formidable economies of mass production, so nuclear can never catch up. And in fact, even if SMRs produced free steam, they still could not compete by manyfold with modern renewables or efficiency because the rest of the plant would still cost too much, the non-nuclear part.
Ajay, you mentioned a number for what kind of global temperature increase you saw that we could reach. I think you said we won't reach 1.5 degrees. We could reach 1.7 degrees. And that would still be below 2, but 1.7 is still quite high. And then you assume the deployment of renewables over the coming decades. Can you describe again how you reach that number, how quick you assume that renewables will be able to scale globally?
Well, Thomas, you hit the problem, you hit the nail on the head. It is actually a challenge of the speed with which change occurs. If, we are also talking of things beyond the electricity system. And we are talking of the decarbonization of the system for high temperature heat in particular. If we are able to move towards largely making an electricity system that is decarbonized by, say, the 2040s, the non-electricity system largely by 2050s, and by in another 10 years or so, 2060 or so, we have a system that is largely carbon emissions. That's the basis on which we are looking at a 1.7 degree future. On the other hand, if we're able to accelerate it, we will see a decrease in the 2100 temperature commitment that we have. How much, I don't know. But the basis is that we are looking at 2050 and beyond for decarbonizing the entire economy across the world.
I think
this is largely consistent with the numbers that we have seen come out of the IPCC report released yesterday, which also says that speed is now of the essence.
But that means also speed on the demand side.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So with the government of India and others, RMI formed the Global Cooling Challenge, which was hoping to reduce climate impact of window air conditioners affordably by a factor of 5. What they actually got was about twice that good.
Correct.
And they got it from the two winners, companies that between them, one Indian, one Chinese, one actually part Japanese, between them, they have a quarter of the market in window air conditioners. So this is a good path to market at scale. On the other hand, if we built, say, a block of flats properly, well, Theodor Thadani showed if you just do a simple double wall that is convectively cooled, then inside you will feel 16 to 19 Celsius degrees cooler. And if you do a few little refinements to that, then you could be comfortable without an air conditioner, let alone needing a small, efficient one. Oh, and by the way, the extra cost was only 2% to build it that way. But then the next revolution is, as I said here last year, now in Singapore, we've learned we can keep people comfortable in the shade but outdoors by purely radiative delivery of cooling. And the heat can be rejected passively with other techniques by selective surfaces into the sky. So that would imply you could do air conditioning in the most hot, humid climates with no air conditioner and no electricity. This could probably be done in a modular way that could even be retrofitted and even into poor households. So I think the demand side revolution is at least as exciting as the supply side. They give us together a more diversified portfolio, they're synergistic. And I think if we push hard on both of them, we will be very surprised at how much faster the revolution goes.
We've been focusing now on the electricity system mainly, but as you have touched on, the very important development will be when you will start using renewable electricity to substitute fossil fuels in other sectors, in industry, in the transport sector. And that is partly because when you start charging batteries and producing hydrogen, you will also be able to use a lot of electricity when electricity is available. and you don't need these charging and fuel production processes when electricity is expensive, because you can easily store the energy as a fuel or in charged batteries. How fast do you think this development can go? When we heard Alessandro describing the US plans, it was very much electricity focused, not on other sectors. Amory, can you say something on what potential you see in defossilizing other industrial sectors?
I think it's going to go a lot faster than expected. I was recently watching on a Chinese major industrialist's smartphone as he showed a gigawatt scale solar hydrogen plant on which he's now running his chemical works because it's cheaper than coal. And I believe the cost of his hydrogen worked out to $2.7 a kilogram, which is something most people thought you wouldn't get to for at least a decade.
Yeah.
And I should also emphasize, speaking of Alejandro's talk, he showed some rather scary numbers about the land needed for, say, wind power or solar. Well, let's see. On solar, there's now a new paper in Nature showing you could run all the world's electricity needs just on rooftop solar if you wanted to. But of course, you have other renewables too. But then the wind number came from a study from Princeton, which assumed electricity demand in 2050 would be 2 to 4 times what we found in the Reinventing Fire book for the same GDP. And yet that quadrupled US electric efficiency would cost only 1/10 as much as buying retail electricity. So we didn't buy nearly enough efficiency, but the study that generated those huge land needs assumed 2 to 4 times less efficiency. So they didn't buy anywhere near enough. And I think these big land use problems, which they showed in such impressive detail, are simply an artifact of not properly competing or comparing efficient use with supply.
Li Yunfeng, is China leading the development of renewable-based hydrogen in industry, or where are you?
Not really. China need to learn a lot from Japan and other countries. Our hydrogen just started. It's a lot of debate, argument. It's only very small the kind of demonstration project in, I mean, we call it green hydrogen. Mainly with green hydrogen, since China, for the refineries, the coal chemicals, they have a lot of the hydrogen use, but not in terms of the low carbon hydrogen use. The Chinese green the hydrogen use need a long way to go. But the Chinese government and the companies make a big kind of effort to try to the large scale of use, especially for the kind of fuel cells for the heavy duty truck use. So that's a lot of contributions, but only in the start, very, very beginning. We could see the lead of the world when that studied. I need to learn from Japan.
Well, we all need to learn from China too. My passive solar banana farm here uses 6,000-year-old North Chinese passive solar architecture. We had just updated the technology. And we would all love to know how China installs renewables with such extraordinary speed. Now, it's true, I think, that India has the cheapest solar in the world, but China has the biggest scaling that on a scale nobody could imagine. So I think we all have a great deal to learn from each other. And remember also that little corrugated floor slab I showed from Germany, saving 3/4 of the concrete and all the steel. Now, China and India both build a lot of mid and high-rise concrete buildings. If this were adopted by the structural engineers and they were properly rewarded for elegantly frugal use of concrete and steel, you wouldn't need to make nearly as much of it, and your hydrogen problem for process heat would become very much easier.
Emily, that's a great idea.
Please go on.
One of the challenges that we face as far as hydrogen is concerned is, as Emily mentioned, the price issue. And seeing that we are already at $2.7 per kg is great news. When we convert solar electricity and use it to split water, the price that we are getting for hydrogen is somewhere in the vicinity of $5 to $5.50 per kg. Gas reformation, on the other hand, produces hydrogen at about $2 per kg, or slightly less than $2. The challenge, of course, is how do we create demand? All the efforts at hydrogen have been focused on the supply side, not on the demand side. In my view, in the next few years, we will start seeing a variety of opportunities where we'll start using hydrogen. And it is quite possible that initially the hydrogen that is used could be from gray sources, then blue sources, and finally green sources. But I think getting industries used to using hydrogen is extremely important for the transition to occur.
Yeah, and this means
I will come back to that in the afternoon.
This means innovation not only in technology and design and finance, but also in business model. In a couple of papers last year, I suggested that, for example, cement companies, rather than selling tons of cement, could lease the resulting structural service, and then interests of the cement provider and the customer are fully aligned. You end up with elegantly frugal structural design, reward the designers for it. And for example, you would pay for, not for buying a bridge, but for safely and efficiently moving people across a bridge. When you align interests in that way, as we've discovered with electrical services, there's nothing more powerful than that, because both the provider and the customer make money the same way by doing more and better with less for longer. If we start doing that with these energy intensive materials, we'll find the process heat problem, like heavy transport, gets a lot easier than we expected.
Okay, we are approaching 12 o'clock in Japan, 4 o'clock in the morning in Sweden, and it's time for a break soon. I would like to thank you all three for your insightful contributions to this session, your reviews of your respective countries' position, and all these grand opportunities for future development. In the afternoon, we will have a session where we will celebrate the 10 years of Renewable Energy Institute's activities and the rapid development in the world that has occurred during these 10 years that have been decisive in shaping the future, and which we have heard parts of already. So again, thank you three for your contributions, and welcome back in an hour for the session on which will be started by Masayoshi Son's special message. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is the conclusion of the first part. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Revision 2022, the technology session will start from 13 p.m. Japan time. See you in 1 hour. Simultaneous translation is available. In order to choose the language, at the bottom of the Zoom screen, please click the Earth mark and select either English or Japanese. Thank you.